What if two ancient civilizations, separated by half the planet, shared the same idea? Not similar, not inspired, but identical, the kind of identical that shouldn't exist. The kind that forces you to stop and question everything, because this story doesn't begin with a theory. It begins with a body, frozen silent, waiting beneath layers of ice for thousands of years. High in the Altai Mountains, in what is now southern Siberia, the world feels untouched. The air is thin. The silence is overwhelming. And the ground never truly forgets. Beneath layers of permafrost, time slows down. Organic material doesn't decay the way it does elsewhere. It waits, preserved, until someone digs deep enough to find it. And in the early 1990s, that's exactly what happened. A team of Russian archaeologists was working in the Yukok Plateau, a remote stretch of land near the borders of Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan, a place so isolated that even today, reaching it is difficult. They were investigating ancient burial mounds, known as kurgans. These mounds had been built thousands of years ago by nomadic tribes. Inside them, the dead were laid to rest with care. Sometimes with objects, sometimes with animals, sometimes with stories. But what the team found inside one particular burial mound was something else entirely. The tomb had been disturbed in ancient times. Grave robbers had already passed through. That usually meant one thing: whatever was valuable was gone. But this time, something unexpected had happened. Water had seeped into the chamber, and over centuries, it froze, solid, turning the entire burial into a block of ice, sealing it, protecting it, preserving everything inside, including her. When the ice was carefully removed, they saw a human form, wrapped, curled, salieving. She was lying on her side, knees bent slightly, as if resting. Her clothing was still there, her hair still arranged. Even the details of her face, faintly visible. She wasn't just preserved, she was remembered by the earth itself. The team realized immediately, this was no ordinary find. This was one of the most well-preserved ancient human bodies ever discovered. She would later be called the Siberian Ice Maiden, believed to belong to the Pazyryk culture, a nomadic group that lived roughly 20,500 years ago. But even that estimate would later raise questions, because the deeper they looked, the stranger things became. At first, the focus was on her burial, the objects around her, the horses that had been sacrificed and buried alongside her. 6 of them, carefully arranged, decorated, as if prepared for a journey. This suggested status, impermanence. She wasn't just anyone, she was someone who mattered, possibly a spiritual figure, possibly a healer, possibly something we don't fully understand. But then they saw her skin. It wasn't immediately obvious. The lighting was low, the surface slightly discolored from time. But as they examined her arms, they noticed something beneath the surface. Faint lines, curves to fauces anges. At first they thought it might be natural markings, damage, but then someone looked closer, and everything changed. These weren't marks. They were tattoos. Ancient tattoos are rare, extremely rare. Skin doesn't usually survive long enough. And when it does, the details are often lost. But here, in this frozen silence, the tattoos were still visible, clear enough to study, clear enough to trace, clear enough to tell a story. Running along her arm were animals, not realistic ones, but stylized, elongated, twisted into elegant, flowing shapes. A deer, but not just a deer. A deer with exaggerated antlers that curled into spirals, its body stretched, almost floating, as if it belonged to another world. There were also predators, creatures locked in motion, their bodies intertwined, their forms blending into patterns. It wasn't just art, it was symbolic, intentional, complex. This wasn't decoration, this meant something. Researchers were stunned because this level of tattoo artistry was advanced, highly advanced. It suggested a deep cultural tradition, a system of meaning, possibly even storytelling through the body itself. But at the time, they believed this was unique, a signature of the Pazyryk people, something isolated, something local. That assumption would not last. Years passed. The Ice Maiden became famous in archaeological circles. Her tattoos were studied, reconstructed, analyzed. Scholars tried to interpret their meaning. Some believed they represented spiritual protection. Others thought they marked status or identity. Some even suggested they were connected to shamanistic rituals. But there was no clear answer, only theories. And then something strange happened. Across the world, on a completely different continent, another team of researchers was studying ancient remains. This time in Ecuador, deep in South America, a place with its own rich history, its own ancient cultures, its own traditions, and among these discoveries were tattoos, old ones, very old. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Tattooing has existed in many cultures. Different regions develop their own styles, their own symbols, their own meanings. That's expected. But then, someone noticed something. A pattern, a shape, a design that felt familiar. They compared it carefully. Side by side, Siberia, Ecuador, two entirely different worlds, separated by oceans, separated by time, separated by everything we understand about ancient human movement. And yet, the designs matched. Not loosely, not vaguely, but in a way that made no sense. The same flowing animal forms, the same elongated bodies, the same artistic style, the same symbolic structure. It wasn't coincidence, it couldn't be. Because for this to be coincidence, two completely separate cultures would have had to invent the exact same artistic language down to the smallest details without ever meeting, without ever communicating, without ever knowing the other existed. And that is where the mystery begins. Researchers were cautious. They had to be. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So they checked again, and again, and again. They analyzed the patterns. They mapped the shapes. They compared proportions, angles, flow, structure, everything, and each time, the conclusion was the same. These designs were too similar to ignore. So the question changed. It was no longer, what do these tattoos mean? Now it became, how did they exist in two places at once? Because if these patterns truly originated in Siberia, how did they appear in Ecuador? And if they originated in South America, how did they reach the Altai Mountains? There was no known trade route, no migration path connecting these regions 6,000 years ago, no historical record, no evidence of contact, at least, not according to conventional history. But then, a deeper look revealed something even more unsettling. Because the more they studied the timelines, the more inconsistent things became. Some evidence suggested the designs could be older than initially thought, much older. Older than the Ice Maiden herself, older than the Pazyryk culture, possibly tracing back thousands of years earlier. And if that was true, then this wasn't just a connection between two cultures. This was something far older, something that reached further back into human history than we expected. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because when researchers began to explore alternative explanations, they found themselves asking questions that didn't have easy answers. Could there have been ancient contact between continents far earlier than we believe? Could there have been forgotten migration routes, lost connections? Or was this something else entirely? Some proposed the idea of independent invention, that similar environments can produce similar ideas, that humans, no matter where they are, can think in similar ways. But this explanation had a problem, because while ideas can be similar, execution rarely is. Art styles, especially complex symbolic ones, are deeply cultural. They carry identity. They evolve within communities. They don't just appear, fully formed, in two distant places, exactly the same. Others suggested ancient travel, early seafaring, unknown connections between continents. But again, there was no clear evidence, no ships, no records, no settlements connecting Siberia and South America in that time period. Nothing that could explain how such a precise artistic tradition could travel that far. And then, there was a third possibility, one that made many researchers uncomfortable, because it suggested something we don't like to admit, that maybe our understanding of ancient history is incomplete. Maybe there were connections we haven't discovered yet. Maybe entire chapters of human movement have been lost, erased by time, buried beneath layers of earth, water, and ice. Or maybe these tattoos are not just art, but fragments, clues, remnants of a shared human story that stretches far beyond what we currently know. Because think about it, why tattoos? Why something so personal, so permanent? If these designs carried meaning, then that meaning traveled, or it existed before the cultures themselves split apart, which raises an even deeper question. What if these patterns didn't originate in Siberia or Ecuador? What if they came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, somewhere we haven't found yet? And if that's true, then the Ice Maiden isn't just a preserved body. She's a messenger, carrying symbols from a past we don't fully understand. A past that may connect distant parts of the world in ways we never imagined. But here's where things become even more unsettling. Because when researchers began to look beyond the tattoos, they found something else, something hidden, something that would take this mystery to an entirely new level. And it wasn't in the patterns, it was in the DNA. Because what they discovered next didn't just challenge archaeology, it challenged everything we thought we knew about ancient humans. The body in the ice, the tattoos that shouldn't exist, two distant worlds, somehow sharing the same visual language. That was where we left off. But the patterns were only the beginning. Because when scientists looked deeper, they didn't just study the skin, they studied what was beneath it, and that's when everything shifted. At first, the goal was simple: extract DNA. Understand who she was, where she came from, what her people were like, standard procedure in modern archaeology. But this wasn't a standard case, because the Ice Maiden wasn't just preserved. She was exceptionally preserved, which meant something rare. Her DNA was still intact. Samples were taken carefully, slowly, every step controlled, because contamination could ruin everything. And when the analysis began, researchers expected a familiar result: genetic markers consistent with ancient Siberian populations, links to Eurasian ancestry, maybe some variation. But nothing unexpected, nothing that would rewrite history. But then something strange appeared, small at first, easy to overlook. A pattern in the genetic data that didn't quite fit. At first, they thought it was an error that happens. Ancient DNA is fragile, it degrades, fragments mix, signals blur. So they ran the tests again, and again, and again, each time refining the process, each time eliminating possible contamination, each time expecting the anomaly to disappear. But it didn't, because buried within her genetic profile were markers that raised questions, not definitive answers, but questions, the kind that make researchers pause, the kind that don't fit cleanly into existing models. Some of these markers showed unexpected similarities to populations far beyond Siberia, not direct matches, not proof of contact. but enough to suggest that something complex, something layered, a history not fully mapped. And this is where the story becomes more subtle, because science doesn't deal in dramatic conclusions. It deals in probability, in evidence, in careful interpretation. So, no one claimed that the Ice Maiden came from South America. That would be misleading. That would be wrong. But what they did acknowledge was that ancient human populations were far more dynamic than once believed. Movement wasn't always simple. It wasn't always linear. And connections may have existed in ways we don't yet fully understand. Meanwhile, across the world in Ecuador, researchers were asking their own questions about the tattoos, about their origins, about their meaning, because if the designs weren't isolated, then where did they come from? They studied local cultures, ancient traditions, symbol systems. And while there were connections within the region, those specific flowing animal forms, that exact artistic style, didn't fully belong, not entirely. It was as if they were part of something older. Something that had been inherited, adapted, but not originally created there. And that's when a new idea began to form, quietly, carefully, without bold claims, without dramatic headlines. Just a possibility. What if these patterns weren't created independently? And what if they didn't travel directly from Siberia to Ecuador, or the other way around? What if they both came from a shared source, not a place we know, not a culture we've fully discovered, but something earlier, something deeper in human history? Because if you trace human migration far enough back, all paths begin to converge. Human beings didn't always live separated by oceans. There was a time when the world looked different. Sea levels were lower, land bridges existed. Conchings that are now impossible were once open. One of the most well-known of these is Beringia, a vast land bridge that once connected Siberia to North America. Thousands of years ago, humans crossed it, not in a single wave, but in many. Over generations, slowly spreading across continents, eventually reaching South America. This is not speculation. This is supported by evidence, archaeological, genetic, environmental. But here's where things get interesting. Because these migrations didn't happen overnight, they unfolded over thousands of years. And during that time, cultures formed, ideas developed, symbols were created. So what if some of those ideas, some of those symbols, traveled with them, not as exact copies, but as traditions, as artistic expressions passed down through generations, evolving slightly, adapting to new environments, but still carrying the same core identity? And what if the tattoo patterns we see are remnants of that? Fragments of an ancient symbolic language that existed before continents felt so far apart. This doesn't mean there was direct contact between Siberia and Ecuador 6,000 years ago. It doesn't mean ships crossed oceans or that civilizations communicated across vast distances, but it does suggest something equally powerful. That human culture, at its roots, may be more connected than we think. The Ice Maiden's tattoos and the Ecuadorian designs may not be copies of each other, they may be echoes. Echoes of a shared past, a time when human stories were not yet divided by geography, when ideas moved with people, across land, across generations, across time. But even this explanation doesn't answer everything, because the level of similarity is still surprising, still unusual, still difficult to fully explain. And that leaves room for uncertainty, for mystery, for the possibility that we are still missing pieces of the puzzle. Because archaeology is not a complete story. It's a collection of fragments, bits of evidence, moments frozen in time, and sometimes those fragments don't line up the way we expect. The Ice Maiden reminds us of that. She forces us to look again, to question assumptions, to consider that history is not as fixed as we like to believe. And maybe that's the most important part of this story. Not proving a single theory, not forcing a conclusion, but recognizing that the past is deeper than we understand. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, a person chose to mark their skin, to carry symbols with them, symbols that meant something, symbols that told a story, and somehow that story didn't stay in one place. It traveled through time, through people, through memory, until one day it appeared again on the other side of the world, and we are only just beginning to notice. So the next time we think of ancient history as distant, sticked, and complete, remember this: a frozen body in Siberia and a set of patterns in Ecuador are still asking questions, and we don't yet have all the answers. Maybe we never will. Or maybe they're still waiting to be discovered.